And friends, would you please stand as you're able for the reading of God's Word this morning, which is from the Gospel of Matthew and also from the book of Joshua. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. And Joshua the son of Nun sent 2 men secretly from Shittim as spies, saying, "Go, view the land, especially Jericho." And they went and came into the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told to the king of Jericho, "Behold, men of Israel have come here tonight to search out the land." Then the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the land." But the woman had taken the 2 men and hidden them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Well, good morning. Let me add my welcome. I'm Matt. I serve as the pastor here, and throughout the month of December and the Advent season, we're looking at the family tree of Jesus, his genealogy as it's recorded in Matthew chapter 1, and specifically, we're looking at the women that are included in the family tree of Jesus. And I said last week when we began this overview that it's unusual in the ancient world to include women in the genealogy because women didn't have rights. In that day, they didn't have legal claims to property or inheritances, which genealogies were the way that you adjudicated those things in that time. And so the inclusion of women in your genealogy, your family tree, your resume, wasn't anything that would have made it stand out. If anything, it wouldn't have bolstered your resume. It would have worked against it. But Matthew includes 5 women in his genealogy. And because this wasn't the standard operating procedure of the day, it should serve as something to tip us off and make us curious and ask the question, why? Why did Matthew include these women in his family tree? And why does Matthew tell us about them? And so last week we looked at Tamar and saw that she's included in Matthew's genealogy because it shows us that God is passionate about justice. And we're going to look at the story of Rahab together. And if you have a Bible or a Bible app, I invite you to open it back up to Joshua chapter 2 because we're going to look at her story in a little bit greater detail. But I want us to consider a couple of lessons that Rahab has to teach us about Jesus and his mission, about why Matthew saw it fit to include Rahab in the family tree of Jesus. And what I want us to see is that Rahab has a lesson to teach us about, first, belief. And then secondly, she has a lesson to teach us about belonging. So Rahab can teach us a lesson about belief and a lesson about belonging. And so to teach us this lesson about belief, we need to immerse ourselves a little bit in Rahab's story in Joshua 2. So Joshua opens up with Israel on the verge of entering into the promised land, the area that God had promised Abraham centuries ago that his descendants would one day possess. And now they're on the verge of entering into that promise. They've been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. The time has come for Israel to come in and take the land. And at the top of the list of the cities of entering into the promised land is the city of Jericho, this imposing city. Think like the Fort Knox of the promised land. Heavily defended, thick walls, a city not easily taken. And in verse 1 of the text, Joshua sends out 2 spies to do some recon on the city. And so they go, and the place that they end up is a brothel, right? The house of Rahab, a prostitute. And although this seems strange or off-putting to our ears as we read the story, it's actually quite strategic. Because think about it. Where would you go in traveling as an outsider to a foreign city? Where would you want to go to a place where it could be normal, even expected to conceal your identity? It could be a place where loose lips might be sharing the matters of the day, a place you can go and not attract a ton of attention. You would go to the brothel. And so Joshua sends out the 2 spies, but no sooner do they arrive in Jericho then they're found out, right? Verse 1, spies sent out. Verse 2, spies discovered, right? Not great intelligence work, not great espionage. And this chapter could have been very short, right? Verse 1, spies sent out. Verse 2, spies discovered. Verse 3, spies executed, if not for the cleverness and the strategy of Rahab, who takes them in and comes up with this plan. See, first, she hides the spies up on the roof of her house. And then second, when the officers of Jericho PD come knocking on her door, she says, oh, those guys, they were just here. They went that way. And she sends them on a goose chase. And off they go. And you think that they might be in the clear, that as the search party goes out, the city gate shuts behind them, and now the spies are trapped. They're shut in. They're stuck behind enemy lines, and they have nowhere else to go. And in Joshua 2, as the drama is now starting to rise up to a boil, the author pushes pause on it. And instead of telling us how the story ends, we enter into this smaller vignette, this part of the story where Rahab actually has a conversation with the spies. And you could say it's a conversation, but honestly, it reads a little bit more like a sermon. Like Rahab the prostitute in this moment has become Rahab a preacher, and she shares what she's learned about the God of Israel. And you could tell it's somewhat of a sermon because it has 3 points. So if you look at it, in verse 10, Rahab's little homily starts off by talking about the might of the God that she's heard about, the God of Israel. She says, it's interesting that wherever you go, your God has this habit of going on before you. Your God has this incredible power that's delivered you out of Egypt. And now we've heard about this God and our hearts have melted within us. We're full of fear because we've seen what your God has done to the people of Egypt and to the people of the Amorites before us. And now they know that God who has gone before you is now on our doorstep, and our hearts are full of fear. She recognizes that if the gods of those countries hadn't stopped the people of Israel, what chance do the people of Jericho have? But then, secondly, Rahab moves on from talking about the might of God to talking about the majesty of God. You see this in verse 11. She talks about the God of Israel being the God of the heavens above and of the earth beneath. He's God over all, over everything. And this is a remarkable statement because, remember, the people of the land of Canaan, the people of the land of Jericho were polytheistic, meaning that they believed in a whole number, right, a whole pantheon of gods. And each god was over a certain realm or domain. And so if you needed something to go well in your life, you needed to Google that kind of god that you needed to appease and then make a sacrifice to it. So if you wanted good crops, right, if you wanted rain, there was a god for that. If you wanted children, there was a god of fertility. And so you made a sacrifice to that god to get them on your side. But Rahab recognizes that the God of Israel is not just like another god in the pantheon. He is the God over everything, the God of the heavens above, the God of the earth beneath, that everything in all creation, seen and unseen, reports directly to the God of Israel. He's majestic and powerful, and there's none like him. But in recognizing both the might and the majesty of God, it causes her to, thirdly, cast herself on the mercy of God. She recognizes God's might and majesty, and she casts herself on the mercy of God. In verse 12, Rahab pleads with the spies, saying, because I have dealt kindly with you, hiding you, keeping you safe from danger, sending people in the wrong direction, looking for you. Because I've dealt kindly with you, would you please deal kindly with me and my family when you come to take the city? And that phrase, deal kindly, is actually the Hebrew word for hesed, which is the word that's used in the Old Testament to describe the kind of love that God has for his people, his covenant faithfulness, his steadfast love that will endure and be faithful even when we are faithless. She says that because I've shown hesed to you, will you show hesed to me and my father's family when you come to take the city? And I love what the biblical commentator on this passage, a guy named Dale Ralph Davis, writes. He says, genuine faith never rests content with being convinced of the reality of God, but it presses on to take refuge in God. Right? Genuine faith does more than recognize that God is real. Genuine faith says, I need to find refuge in that God who is real. And knowing of God's might and majesty were only enough to make Rahab afraid and terrified. But seeing God for who he is causes herself to cling to and cast herself on the mercy of God. And the end result is that she's saved. And can you imagine with me maybe some of the awkward conversation that followed when the spies left, and Rahab's calling up her family, telling them to come to the brothel because it's in this home that they'll be saved. She has a conversation with her mom. Hey, Mom, I know it's been maybe since last Thanksgiving, last Christmas that we talked. I really need you to come to the brothel. She calls up her brother whom she's estranged with and says, hey, you know how things ended poorly with us this time? Please listen and please come. And when the people of Jericho, when the Israelites do come to take Jericho, we find that the spies follow through on their word. That the city is taken, the walls of Jericho come crumbling down, but every person in the house of Rahab is spared because they gave her a command. They said, set this scarlet cord out of your window, and when we come back, everyone that's in this home under the scarlet cord, everyone who finds refuge in this house will be saved. And that's exactly what happens. Everything comes about exactly the way things were promised. So that's Joshua chapter 2. Now, what's the lesson about belief in this story? Well, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is the nature of faith? What is faith after all? And at its most basic elements, faith is simply the demonstration of trust. It's placing your trust, all of your confidence, all of your surety into someone or something that you think will sustain you, something that you think will buoy you when the storms of life come to batter and shake you. And in this story, Rahab makes a profession of faith in the God of Israel. She says, I've put my trust in your God because I think he is strong enough, big enough, majestic enough to save me. And think about it for a second. Right? Rahab isn't an Israelite, right? She lived hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from the Israelites when they were in Egypt and when they were in the wilderness. She wasn't an eyewitness of the Exodus, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the manna in the wilderness. So of all people, how did Rahab come to know and believe and put her trust in the God of Israel? More likely than not, she learned about the Lord from her clients, right? The people who would come and pay for her services. She also likely heard about God at the city gate where business and government was done and transacted. So from pillow talk to the public square, Rahab is hearing stories about the majesty and the might and the mercy of God. And she probably didn't have all the answers, right? She probably couldn't articulate to you the doctrine of the Trinity or how the balance between God's sovereignty and human responsibility and how those things relate and work out. But what she did know about God was enough to save her. And not only that, this small of faith didn't just save her and her family in the day of judgment. It was enough to put her in the family tree of Jesus. And in fact, when you go to the New Testament book of Hebrews, chapter 11, right, the Bible's hall of fame in terms of people of faith, you know whose name you'll find in there? Rahab's. You'll find Rahab's name in Hebrews 11. And so what does that mean for us? Let me ask, how shaky is your faith today? How weak do you feel the belief that you might have in God? Or how incomplete do you feel like your knowledge of Jesus is this morning? Because if what Rahab shows us is if the faith of this Canaanite pagan woman prostitute, right, the racial, religious, social, moral outsider, has enough faith that's sufficient, even what Hebrews 11 says is exemplary, then that's astounding, because the point about belief is that at the end of the day, it isn't about the amount of faith you possess. It's about the object of your faith that matters. So strong faith, think about it. Strong faith in a weak object will always fail you. Right? Strong faith in a weak object will always let you down every single time. It will always fail to deliver. But if you have weak faith in a strong object, it will save you, because at the end of the day, it's not about the strength of faith that you possess. It's about the object of your faith and whether it is big enough and strong enough to hold you, regardless of how strong your faith is in the moment. The late pastor, Tim Keller, was fond of using this analogy. He said to imagine that you're falling off of a cliff, and out of the corner of your eye, you see a little tree branch hanging on the side of the mountain. He says, does it matter in that moment that you have strong faith when you reach out to that branch that will hold you and save you as you fall? Or if you have weak faith and you're just reaching out for that branch as your best last hope? He says, at the end of the day, it's not the amount of faith that you possess in the branch that saves you. What matters is if the branch is strong enough to hold you. If its roots go deep enough into the cliff that will anchor you whenever you reach out for it to support your weight as you fall. And friends, it's the same about faith. What matters is not whether our faith is strong or weak, comprehensive or incomplete, but what matters is the object of your faith, is the God that you're reaching out to for help and hope and mercy and grace. Is he strong enough to sustain you? Is he strong enough to bear the weight of all of your problems, of your pressures, of your anxieties and worries? You see, if you have a weak faith, but place that faith in him, then he will sustain you, no matter how flimsy your faith or belief might feel in that moment. And the truth is, friends, that this morning we're all putting our belief, our trust in something, whether that's our career or our education, our plans, our finances, our family and kids. And the question for us is, are those things strong enough to bear the weight of our existence? Are they durable enough to sustain you in suffering? Rahab's faith shows us that even a weak faith placed in the right object is enough for you to be immortalized in the pages of Scripture, to be included in the family tree of Jesus. And so if you're here this morning and you're thinking to yourself, I don't have enough faith, look at Rahab. Rahab had a scrap of faith and it was enough for her. You might be here thinking, I have an incomplete knowledge of God. I need to have a better idea of who God is before I can trust in him. Rahab had an incomplete knowledge of God, and yet that knowledge that she did have and cling to and trust and put in God was enough to make all the difference in her life. So friends, what's keeping you away this morning? Because Christian belief isn't about having all the answers or having it all together. It's about mustering all the belief you have, even if it's as small as a mustard seed, as Jesus would say, and placing it in a strong object that will save you and deliver you every single time. That's Rahab's lesson about belief for us this morning, but consider also the lesson about belonging that Rahab has to teach us as well. Consider again that Rahab is the outsider of all outsiders, right? Morally, she's an outsider because of her profession. Socially, she's an outsider because of her work. Religiously, she's an outsider because she's, part of the Canaanite religion, not the Jewish religion. Racially, ethnically, she's an outsider. She's a Gentile, not a Jewish person. Right? She's an outsider in every conceivable way, but yet she's listed in the family tree of Jesus. Genealogies were important in the ancient world. In fact, King Herod, who was the king at the time that Jesus was born, was so ashamed of his genealogy because he was only half Jewish that he made it his goal to destroy all the genealogical records in his province so that he could cover up for what he was ashamed of in his own family tree. But yet Matthew goes out of the way to include 4 Gentile women in his genealogy, of whom Rahab is one. So why is that? Well, I think the gospel writer Matthew is trying to make a point to his readers and who are largely Jewish believers. And he's saying that Jesus has come to save all kinds of people. There's no one who's outside Jesus' ability to save. And when it comes to salvation, the ground is level. In God's eyes, it's not that there's an inside group and an outside group. In God's eyes, we're all outsiders. You go to the letter of Paul, Romans chapter 3, he says basically the same thing, that the ground is level at the foot of the cross. All of the different ways we try to make distinctions and divisions among people, ethnically, racially, economically, socially, whether they come from a good family or went to a good school, all of those things go out the window. And Christians who look down on others, who are judgmental, who make these value judgments ourselves about who's in and who's out, aren't actually living out their faith. See, when Christians, when people who claim the name of Christ judge other people in this way, they do so not because they're living out their Christian convictions. They're judgmental because they're actually not Christian enough. They're not listening to the message of grace that's at the center of our faith. They don't get it because if we truly grasp what it means to be a Christian, it means that at one point we were an outsider. It wasn't that we had the right answers or just figured things out or pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps. It's that we were alienated from God. We were estranged from him, in need of grace, in need of help from the outside. And that apart from the grace of God, we would be an outsider and continue to be an outsider if not for the cross. So the lesson about community is that every community that isn't seasoned with the gospel will tend to demonize other people or based on something or someone so that we can know who we are. And this is, if you look at it, this is what's playing out in our culture. We're all using our identities and weaponizing them against one another, that we're defining who we are in contrast to another group of people, that we know that we're okay because we're not like those people over there. And this has been true throughout all time, right? Traditional cultures prioritize the family and look down on single people. Modern people, champion their resume and ambition, and anybody who's not willing to compete is pushed out to the margins. But Matthew says, the Gospels say, Jesus says that we're to resist this tendency. You see, God brought Rahab and made her a part of Jesus' family because that's how grace works. The way that grace works is that grace doesn't divide people out. Grace brings people in. And that is the mark, that ought to be the mark of every gospel-shaped, grace-based community. You see, the gospel is, the message of Christmas is that if Rahab, the outsider of all outsiders, is in, then friends, we're in as well. There's no one that is outside the reach or the grace of God. Anybody can be a part of it, and that means anybody you meet on campus, in the workplace, in your neighborhood, at school. Anybody you meet can be somebody that God is coming for right now. Anybody that you meet is somebody who can be part of the family line of Jesus. And so it should lead us to ask, who are the Rahabs of our culture today? Who are the people that the world is quick to push out to the margins and overlook and label an outsider? And what part can we play in bringing them in and helping them experience the belonging that comes with experiencing the grace of God this Advent season? And we can even take this another layer and say, where's the Rahab in you that you don't want the world to see? Where's the Rahab in you that you're hiding from other people? A friend of mine who is really a mentor, he's a pastor in the D.C. area. In his preaching, he's often fond of saying, can we have a little self-awareness chat? So can we have a little self-awareness chat right now? Because if we're honest, there's a little bit of a prostitute in all of us. There's a little bit of something that fills us with such a deep sense of shame that we don't want other people to know or see, for fear of, if they knew this thing about us, it would make us an outsider in their eyes. We've all done things that we're ashamed of. And friends, the good news of Christmas is that you're not defined by those things anymore. Like Rahab, you are not defined by what you've done with your body, because we are defined ultimately by what Jesus has done with his body. We're not defined by the worst thing that we've done. We're defined by what Christ has done for us. You see, Rahab risked her life to let her spies out of the city of Jericho in order to be saved. But friends, Jesus not only risked his life to let us into the city of God, it cost him his life. And knowing that Jesus was vulnerable in that way for our sakes, vulnerable unto death, it should transform us into a people who want to be vulnerable toward others, to give our lives and put our trust, our belief in Jesus, and to extend the invitation for others to come and find help and refuge in him as well. See, if God accepts the Rahabs of the world, it means that God also accepts you. He puts you in his resume. And if you're a Christian this morning, the mighty, majestic God has shown you mercy. And this morning, you should not feel like a fraud. Because when God says you're loved and that you belong, you know what, friends? You have to agree with him. A pastor friend of mine says that when God says things about you, you have to agree with him, even though everything in you and in your circumstances is shouting otherwise. If God says you are if you are beloved, if you belong, if you're forgiven, if you're set free in him, friends, muster up all the courage and faith that you have and believe him. When God says something about you, we have to believe him. Rahab took shelter under the scarlet cord, and friends, we find refuge and help in something so much stronger, so much greater, the blood of Jesus this morning. So let's put our belief there, however strong or weak your trust, your belief might be this morning, and let's compel others to come and belong and find shelter there as well. Would you pray with me?